welcome back to Wild Tomorrow. I'm Katie Byers, and today we're talking about 31 sloths that died in a Florida warehouse between December 2024 and February 2025. As you can tell, my voice is just not at its greatest, so just bear with me. I want to be upfront about why this story matters to me personally. Earlier this year, I took my first international trip to Costa Rica. I watched sloths moving through the rainforest canopy, doing exactly what sloths are supposed to do, and the whole time I kept thinking about those 31 animals, about what their last months looked like, about the gap between what we tell ourselves wildlife tourism is and what it actually is. That gap is what this episode is about. So let's start with what actually happened because the details do matter here. Sloth World Orlando was preparing to open on International Drive, which, if you're not familiar with Orlando, is basically the strip of tourist attractions right by the theme parks. It's prime real estate and prime tourist traffic. The attraction never opened. Not once, not a single paying customer ever walked through those doors. What was happening behind the scenes was that those sloths were being shipped internationally and held in a staging warehouse about 2 minutes from the planned attraction site. That warehouse was where they were supposed to acclimate before being transferred to the exhibit. In December 2024, Florida had a cold snap. The temperatures dropped to the 40s and 50s in Fahrenheit. For most of us in the South, that's uncomfortable but manageable. For tropical animals being held in an unheated warehouse, it was fatal. 21 sloths died from cold stress. And here's the detail that I keep coming back to. A previous co-owner later told Florida Fish and Wildlife that the warehouse wasn't ready for the incoming animals. They already knew, but it was, to quote him, too late to cancel the shipment. So they let it happen. Then, in February 2025, Sloth World imported 10 more sloths from Peru. 2 arrived already dead. The remaining 8 were described as emaciated and in very poor health. None of them survived. 31 animals dead before the attraction ever opened its doors. The Florida Attorney General has since opened a criminal investigation. The owner announced plans to file for bankruptcy and shut down permanently. 13 surviving sloths were transferred to the Central Florida Zoo, where at least 3 more have died despite receiving expert veterinary care. And here's maybe the most damning detail of all. Regulators didn't even know any of this happened until August 2025, 6 months after the last sloth died. They found out during a routine, unannounced inspection. That tells you everything you need to know about the oversight problem. Now, I want to talk about the language Sloth World used because this is where it gets really insidious. Before they ever opened, they were marketing themselves as educational, connecting people with wildlife, conservation experiences, learning opportunities. That language is doing a lot of work, and it's not accidental. When you call yourself a conservation center, you're not just marketing to tourists. You're positioning yourself as doing something important, something that deserves to exist. And that makes criticism harder because suddenly if you question the facility, you're not questioning a business model. You're supposedly questioning conservation itself. But let's be honest about what the actual business model was. It was access-based interaction tourism. Charge admission for people to touch and photograph sloths. Revenue depends on throughput, on moving as many visitors as possible through the experience each day. That's not conservation. That's not even education. That's a transaction where you pay to stress an animal for your entertainment, and the marketing language exists to obscure that fundamental fact. Real conservation work involves habitat protection, population monitoring, breeding programs coordinated with scientific institutions, research that actually contributes to species survival in the wild. Sloth World wasn't doing any of that. They were importing wild animals from South America and holding them in a warehouse in Orlando. I want to take a minute to talk about why sloths are particularly poorly suited to this kind of model because it's not just that the conditions were bad. It's that the entire concept is incompatible with sloth biology. Sloths can't regulate their body temperature the way most mammals can. They are obligate thermoregulators, which means they depend on their environment to maintain safe body temperature. Cold stress isn't just uncomfortable for them, it's physiologically catastrophic. Below their thermoneutral zone, body temperature drops, metabolic rate crashes, and the animal is in serious danger. You don't have days to fix a heating failure, you have hours. Beyond the temperature issue, sloths are prey animals. They're wired at a deep physiological level to hide from predators. The stress response triggered by being handled by strangers isn't something they can habituate to the way some species might. Every interaction is a threat response. Every day in that environment is chronic stress. The necropsy reports from the animals that died confirmed this. Severe malnutrition, depleted fat reserves, muscle wasting, untreated respiratory and gastrointestinal infections, hypothermia-related organ damage. Pathologists describe these conditions as entirely preventable and consistent with chronic neglect. These animals didn't die from bad luck. They died from a business model that put operational convenience above animal welfare at every decision point. Now, I want to go ahead and pause here because I think this is important, especially for anyone listening who works in wildlife rehab or has supported legitimate wildlife education programs. What I'm describing here is not what licensed wildlife rehabilitators do when they work with educational animals. Non-releasable animals in permitted rehab programs are there because the wild already made that determination. An injury, imprinting, permanent disability. State wildlife agencies have assessed these animals and determined they cannot survive on their own. The animal situation is the starting point, and the program is built around that reality. Those animals aren't imported from their native range for profit. They aren't cycled through hundreds of public interactions daily because throughput drives revenue. They live under permitted care standards with welfare requirements built into the permit structure. And the purpose is specific and conservation oriented, helping communities understand and coexist with local wildlife, reducing human wildlife conflict, and building genuine conservation literacy. The difference between that and Sloth World isn't a matter of degree, it's structural. One model starts with an animal that has nowhere else to go and builds around its welfare. The other starts with a profit motive and acquires animals to serve it. I say this because when we talk about accountability for facilities like Sloth World, we need to be precise about what we're holding accountable. We're not talking about the rehabber who brings a non-releasable screech owl to a school presentation. We're talking about operators who import wild-caught tropical animals into unheated warehouses and call it conservation. Conflating those two things doesn't protect wildlife. It just makes it easier for exploitation to hide behind the people actually doing the work. So, how does something like this happen? How do 31 animals die over 2 months and nobody finds out for half a year? The answer is that the regulatory system was never designed to prevent it. Under Florida statute, Class 3 wildlife facilities are required to report escapes, bites, and transfers. They're not required to report animal deaths. Not one, not 31. The FWC conducted its investigation after the August 2025 inspection revealed what had happened, and they found, quote, no intentional misconduct. They issued 0 citations, 0 fines, and they gave a verbal warning for cage violations. Let that sink in for a minute. 31 dead animals, and they got a verbal warning. A functional regulatory system would look completely different. Mandatory unannounced inspections by people who actually understand the biology of the species being kept. Enforceable species-specific standards, temperature requirements, humidity levels, handling protocols, staff-to-animal ratios, veterinary care minimums, financial requirements before you even get a permit, proof of adequate funding, emergency reserves, bonding or insurance to cover animal placement if the facility fails, and mandatory death reporting. That's the main one. The idea that you can operate an exotic animal facility and have no legal obligation to report when animals die is not a loophole. It's a policy choice, and that policy choice has consequences. What we have instead, though, is a reactive system. It responds to disasters after they become public. It investigates after the cameras show up. It acts shocked when the obvious outcomes of its own design choices finally become too dramatic to ignore. There's a pattern here that goes beyond Sloth World, and I think it's worth naming directly. The exotic animal exhibition industry operates with privatized profits and socialized costs. The facility owners collect the revenue while the operation is running. When it collapses, the burden shifts. In this case, it shifted to the Central Florida Zoo, which had to mobilize 10 staff members on short notice to care for 13 animals they weren't planning for, and animals arriving with serious health conditions from inadequate prior care. Legitimate sanctuaries and zoological facilities can't say no to these situations. They can't let animals suffer because of someone else's failures. So they absorb them. They divert resources from their own programs and they carry the cost. And the people who created the situation walk away with no ongoing financial responsibility. There's no requirement for commercial exotic animal facilities to maintain emergency funds for animal placement. No industry-wide safety net, no insurance requirement. The entire backup system is the goodwill of organizations that are already stretched thin. This just isn't sustainable and it isn't fair. But it is the predictable outcome of a regulatory framework that treats animal welfare as secondary to commercial operations. I want to be clear that Sloth World is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of something much, much larger. In East Texas, Tiger Creek Animal Sanctuary faced a federal lawsuit from the Animal Legal Defense Fund over the deaths of at least 9 lions and tigers. The ALDF alleged these deaths resulted from haphazard management and persistently understaffed operations. USDA inspectors had repeatedly cited the facility for failing to meet minimum care requirements. The facility kept operating. During Winter Storm Uri in February 2021, the primary primate sanctuary in San Antonio had to evacuate roughly 60 primates when power failed across the state, housing them in dog crates in a neighbor's home. The storm exposed what the day-to-day obscures. Facilities without adequate infrastructure and emergency planning put animals at serious risk the moment conditions get hard. Different facilities, different species, different emergencies, same underlying failure. Operations that weren't built to prioritize animal welfare when doing so became expensive or inconvenient. The only thing unusual about Sloth World is the scale and the speed. 31 animals in 2 months is hard to ignore. But slower versions of this story are playing out right now at facilities across the country, in animals living with chronic stress, inadequate enclosures, and substandard care that doesn't quite rise to the level of prosecution. We act shocked at the dramatic collapses. We don't talk about the slow ones. So what should actually happen here? Well, first, criminal charges, not just fines, actual consequences that recognize those 31 deaths for what they were, preventable casualties of negligence. The AG investigation needs to result in animal cruelty convictions with penalties severe enough to matter. Permanent bans from exotic animal ownership or employment for the operators involved. Financial liability. They attempted to profit from these animals and they should fund the care of the survivors and compensate the facilities that absorbed them. And systemically, this case should set precedent. Conservation branding should not shield operators from accountability when animals die under their care. Mortality rates above defined thresholds should trigger automatic license revocation. Death reporting should be mandatory. Financial requirements should be built into the permitting process, not bolted on after a disaster. Most importantly, we need to stop treating commercial exotic animal exhibition facilities as legitimate conservation operations and start being honest about what they are. Businesses that profit from animal exploitation. Once we're clear about that, we can have real conversations about what oversight actually needs to look like. So what can you do? I want to close with something practical because I know a lot of people who listen to this show genuinely care about wildlife and don't want to contribute to this kind of harm. Before you buy a ticket to any wildlife experience, ask yourself 3 questions. If this animal had a choice, would it choose to be here? For a sloth, the answer is always no. No wild-caught tropical animal chooses a Florida warehouse over its native canopy. What are you actually paying for? If the facility were genuinely doing conservation work, the animals wouldn't be available for you to touch. Access to animals is the product. Conservation is the branding. Finally, who profits and who pays the cost? Well, the operator profits. You get the experience. The animal pays with its stress, its health, and sometimes its life. The best thing most of us can do for wildlife is just leave it alone. Real conservation happens in the field, in habitat protection, in research that doesn't require animals to perform for tourists. Seeing a sloth in a tree in Costa Rica from a distance without touching it is more valuable than holding one in a Florida strip mall. That moment of genuine observation, of watching an animal be exactly what it is in the place it belongs, that's the real thing. Everything else is a transaction dressed up in conservation language. Those 31 sloths paid the ultimate price for that lie. Every ticket sold at facilities like this ensures more animals will follow. That's Wild Tomorrow for today. If this episode resonated with you, share it. The people making decisions about where to spend their wildlife tourism dollars need to hear this. If you want to support actual conservation work, I'll have links in the show notes to organizations doing legitimate habitat protection and species research. I'm Katie Byers. Thanks for being here.